As I said in the overview, the first unit in this course deals with Taiwan's early history before the modern economic development. And I divide this unit up into 4 sections. The first section is Taiwan in the 17th century. Okay. This is when Taiwan's history really begins. This is when we start getting written records coming out of Taiwan, so we know more what was happening then. And the earliest written records are generally Dutch. That's the Dutch came to Taiwan to set up a trading base here. The second unit looks at Taiwan under the Qing. And in particular, what we're looking at is Taiwanese development of the land and development of water resources. Water is very important to Taiwan's agriculture. There's a lot of irrigation here. The third section deals with the camphor industry. You may know almost nothing about camphor, but it was an important industry up until the early 20th century. So we're moving up toward modern times. But the important thing about the camphor industry, as far as I'm concerned, is that it was the frontier industry. It was what opened up Taiwan's mountains. So I'm going to look at camphor to try to understand a little bit about Taiwan's frontier economy. And then finally, we'll look at the limits to Taiwan's economic growth in the pre-modern era. Up into the period of modern economic development, there was growth in Taiwan's GDP, but it was extensive growth. That means it was growth in population. It was pretty impressive. The same amount of land could support more and more and more people. But if you look at GDP per person, the average income of the average person, it didn't change much over this period. In fact, during many decades, it fell. Okay, it pretty much just stagnated through this period. So we will look at why was that? What were the problems that the pre-modern Taiwan economy faced? Okay, in this unit, Taiwan in the 17th century, I want to start out with the Aborigine economy and also say a little bit about kind of prehistoric times. But when the Dutch got here in the early 1600s, they estimated that Taiwan probably held about 100,000 people. That's very little compared to what we see here today. But as I said in the overview, it's about probably what the population density was in the Philippines at this time. Okay. The people were scattered into small towns and villages, and they spoke over a dozen different languages. So these people were divided up into small groups. Each group consisted of several thousand people. So what you see at this time is you do not see any sort of scale economies. And you need, some scale before you really can get good economic progress. If you have just a few hundred people in each village and only a few villages that all speak the same language, that puts a lot of limit on how much research and development you can do and how much investment you can do. Now, if you looked at the Aborigines economy at this time, what you find is that there's a division of labor between men and women. The men really aren't doing that much that's productive. They're the protectors and the predators. They protect their people. They also attack other people. During this period, the Aborigines were headhunters, and they were fighting over land and resources. And complementary to this protection predator sort of occupation, they were also hunters. Because hunting is very good practice, for being in the military. You have to be good with weapons, you got to be stealthy, you got to be quick. So it just makes sense that the people that are defending you also do hunting. Okay? The women seem to be doing most of what we would talk about as economic production in these societies. They did most of the farming, besides the harvesting the deer, what the hunters were doing. They planted the crops, they harvested the crops in most places. They also seem to have done most of the manufacturing. Some of the heavy labor would have been done by men. I think when a house was set up, probably the men were a big part of that construction. But things like cloth or pottery, that would be something probably the women specialized in. Private property was very limited. Individuals had some private property, but as far as, say, the tools of production, this seems to be kind of belonging to the village. And there's a reason for this. Okay? And that's because, you're living in a society where there's a lot of conflict between different groups. And it's very important that you have a strong sense of solidarity within your group. So you don't want people economically competing with each other. One person trying to get rich and get richer than his neighbor. Okay, this is going to cause a lot of jealousy. So basically, what happens in these villages, you have to think of them as kind of places that are being run kind of like companies. Each village is kind of what a company would be in the modern world. It would have a CEO, usually the leader, though politically each village may have been set up a little differently. But basically, there was a leadership, and they kind of decided, what the village was going to do. And most people just followed their lead in most things. The economy was still based on trade, but it was not based on individual trade. Okay, usually what would happen is one village would trade with another village, or very often they would trade with outsiders. So this was although we're saying this is not a very individualist society, trade is still very important. Now, I want to step back and talk a little bit about the prehistoric times, because this is quite interesting for Taiwan. If you go back and look at the Taiwanese aborigines, maybe 2000 BC, about 4,000 years ago, the language they spoke, the languages they spoke were Austronesian languages. And linguists have analyzed the Austronesian languages and used this to try to trace where the Austronesian people come from. And it looks like Austronesians came from Taiwan. And early on, the Austronesian expansion was very important for the world economy. What happens is the Austronesians, they kind of burst out of Taiwan. There may have been a population explosion. Some people think maybe water levels were rising at that time, so maybe there was getting to be less farmland. Okay? And many of the Taiwanese Austronesian aborigines, they left Taiwan. First, they go down to the Philippines and they start settling there. They gradually filter on, settle throughout Southeast Asia in many places. They get down into New Guinea, and then they move into the South Pacific. So Hawaiians, the Maori in New Zealand, okay, the people of Tahiti, okay, almost all of basically all of the Polynesians, their ancestors come from Taiwan. And they also traveled the other direction. Okay. Many of the people in Madagascar today, their ancestors came from Taiwan, okay, the Taiwanese aborigines. Also, they did trading in India. We know this because if you look at the old Indian words for a lot of the more nautical terms, boat terms, they often use Austronesian. Okay, they come from Austronesian roots. So we knew that the Austronesians were there. And they made it all the way up into the Middle East and did some trading there. So the Austronesians, they set up a big trade network, and that was because early on they were some of the best sailors in the world. They were the ones that developed the catamaran, kind of the outrigger canoe, and they learned to do very skillful navigation. Okay. So early on, Taiwan is important to the world economy. There's a lot of out-migration, and there seems to also be a lot of trade. About the Han Dynasty, you see that the Austronesians are very important in helping China, as middlemen, helping Chinese trade with Southeast Asia, and even some of the trade all the way over to India. Now, by the Tang Dynasty, probably because of the lack of economies of scale, the Aborigines are still using the small boats. Okay. Chinese and other cultures, they're developing bigger and bigger ships. So by the Tang Dynasty, the Austronesians are starting to get pushed out of the transport business. And more it's other people coming to Taiwan to trade, and not Taiwanese acting as middlemen and helping other cultures trade. If you go up to Shisanhang, this is a site and kind of up probably northwest of Taipei. Okay, they excavated an archaeological site there and they set up a museum. What's impressive about Shisanhang, this is during the Tang Dynasty. The Aborigines, they had mined there. They had come up with iron ore. They were smelting iron, and they were selling it to the Chinese who would cross the strait and buy it from them. Okay, so we see this sort of trade going on in the Tang Dynasty. Now, when the Dutch come to Taiwan, they see deer trade. And this seems to start probably before the Dutch came, maybe in the late 1500s, possibly earlier. Okay? but there was a big demand in China and in Japan for deer products. Okay? They wanted deer meat, they wanted the deer furs, they wanted the deer antlers. Okay? Well, there was a lot of deer in Taiwan. The Aborigines weren't just hunters who happened to hunt deer in their free time to sell to outsiders. They seemed to be raising the deer in some ways. It was kind of proto-agricultural approach. They would, burn off parts of the forest so they would get lush grasses growing back. That would be to feed the deer, so you could have a really big deer population. And then they would protect the deer, and then gradually, as the deer got mature, they would hunt them. So there was a big deer export coming out of Taiwan in probably the beginning in the late 1500s. Okay, and when the Dutch get here, that's what's going on with the Aborigines. When the Dutch get here, the Aborigines also trade military services to the Dutch for goods. Okay, and you can imagine why this would be. There was a lot of fighting in Taiwan. The Aborigines were good at it. Okay, the Dutch needed protection. They also wanted to keep the Chinese who came over under control. They also wanted to keep other Aborigines, that might attack them under control. So they were happy to hire these Aborigines. And what the Aborigines wanted in return, both for the deer and for their military service, was goods that needed scale economies to produce. Some of the most important goods would probably be metal goods. It doesn't seem like the Aborigines were producing metal goods anymore. Okay? But they also trade other goods. One of the things they would trade to China for was salt. Okay? It seemed like the Chinese had big salt operations that were producing salt rather cheaply. Okay? The Aborigines probably could have produced salt, but it would have probably been more costly for them to do it themselves. Were the Aborigines successful? Okay, a lot of people, I think, when they look at Taiwan today, they see a society where, most people identify as being, Chinese people, basically. Don't identify as being Aborigines. It seems like a situation very similar to in the Americas, where there's a new group of people come in, and the old people kind of get pushed aside and gradually fall in number and become, just kind of a socially marginal minority. I don't think that's really what happens here with the Taiwanese. The Taiwanese Aborigines, I would argue that in many ways they were quite successful. Okay? The most notable success is biological success. Okay? If you want to look at, say, the average Aborigines, back in the early 1600s, how many progeny does he have today? Okay? And compare that with the average Chinese back in the early 1600s. How much progeny does he have today? How many great grandchildren does he have? Okay. Well, we don't have a good calculation for this, but we know that in Taiwan today there's about 500,000 people that identify as Aborigines. Okay, some of these are mountain tribes or mountain groups. Some of them are what you might call as the Pimputsu, the Plains Aborigines. Okay. Now, these people are often mixed blood. So if you're thinking just in terms of genes, you're thinking biologically, if maybe half of their genes are Chinese, half of their genes are Aborigines, you probably discount this population, say, 500,000, half the genetic material is Aborigines, let's call it 250,000. On the other hand, though, if you look at the modern Taiwanese population, in particular, you look at those that came here before World War II, and after World War II, there was a big group of mainlanders that came over. They're a little different. Okay? But you look at these, you find that most of them have some Aborigines genes. They have Aborigines ancestors. Okay? Now, I haven't seen a real good estimate of what percent of the average Taiwanese genetic material comes from Aborigines. What happened is when the Taiwanese start coming over to the Chinese come over to Taiwan and become the Taiwanese, here. Usually it was just men that came over. The women don't usually migrate. And so what happens is when the Taiwanese men came here, they looked for wives, they took Aborigines wives. Okay, so a lot of the Aborigines married into Chinese society. Well, there's maybe about 20 million of these Taiwanese today. maybe about 10% of the genetic material comes from Aborigines. I think that's a pretty good estimate, though it may be new research will change that somewhat. But just a rough estimate. If you say that 20 million people, about 10% of the genetic material is Aborigines, well, it sounds like that's the equivalent of about 2 million, people worth of Aborigines genetic material. Okay? This means that if there was like 100,000 Aborigines in the early 1600s, okay, their populations increased by over 20 times. Okay? Now, if you look at the population of the world, it's increased by about 15 times. The population of Chinese in the world since the early 1600s has only increased about 7 times. So if you're judging by just, how many progeny you have, how many great-great-great-great-grandchildren did you leave behind you, okay? Actually, the Aborigines do very well. Okay? The Chinese, they don't do so well. Now, that's the one kind of idea of success. Maybe though leaving progeny behind isn't the most important thing to you. I mean, there's other types of success. What about economic success? And in this case, you find the people that identify as Aborigines in Taiwan tend to be poorer than the average, Chinese Taiwanese. Okay, but when you talk about the success of the Taiwanese, and you want to compare it to the success of Chinese population overall in the world, well, Taiwan is a particularly rich place. Okay? I wouldn't be surprised if the average Taiwanese was richer, or average Taiwanese Aborigines was richer than the average Chinese, including Chinese in China, in Taiwan, also Singapore, Malaysia, wherever. Okay? Because the bulk of the Chinese are in China today, and China's GDP per person is still much lower than Taiwan. Okay? So in that sense, you could say the Aborigines were maybe more successful than the average Chinese, mainly the average Chinese that stayed home in China. Cultural success. Now that's also something, here in Taiwan, you just look around and you say, well, this looks like kind of a Chinese cultural society. It doesn't really look like an Aborigine society. Okay, so maybe culturally the Aborigines could be argued to be much less successful than the Chinese. Here in Taiwan, most people speak Chinese. They don't speak the Aborigines dialects. Okay, so in that way the Aborigines were less successful. But a big part of success in the world over long periods of time is being able to change. And that's what the Aborigines did. In order to succeed, they had to, adapt to these new immigrants coming in that were originally richer than they were. Okay, they married off their daughters to them. They were willing to make compromises, and they did change, but that's the way they got ahead. The Chinese, of course, changed too. Okay, if you looked at Chinese culture in the early 1600s, it's very different than today. If a Chinese from that period came back to life in 21st century Taiwan and looked around, he might say, this isn't Chinese, this isn't the Chinese culture I know. There's a few similarities, but everything looks so different, So culture changes all the time, okay? And sometimes, the secret to success, though, is you have to let culture change. So I would argue that in many ways you can see that the Aborigines were very successful people. Okay, that's the Aborigine economy. I want to move on and look at the Dutch. The Dutch, they come to Taiwan in the 1620s. What's happening here is that Spain and Portugal in the 1500s, they come into Asia. The Portuguese, they make it all the way into Macau. They set up a trading base there, and then they trade between Macau and Japan. They have bases in Japan. And during this period, the Ming doesn't like any direct trade between China and Japan. The Portuguese take advantage of this. They're running back and forth between Macau and Japan, trading goods. They're selling the Chinese goods that they get in Macau to the Japanese. They bring back Japanese goods, and they sell them on to the Chinese, and they make good profits. The Spanish, to some extent, are also getting into this. They come on, and in the mid-1500s, I think it's about 1560s, 70s, they set up their base in Manila in the Philippines. they're also very interested in doing trading in this area. A lot of their trade, though, is selling silver to China, okay, in return for Chinese manufacturers like silk and furniture and stuff like that. But, they're also interested in doing trade with Japan, too, when they can. The Dutch, they were originally controlled by the Spanish king back in, in Europe. And they revolt, okay, by the late 1500s. They're pretty much independent, though they're still fighting, and all the way into the 1600s, up into the mid-1600s, they're still at war with Spain. Okay. The Spanish king, he's also become, the Portuguese king in the late 1500s and in the early 1600s. So the Dutch, they're at war basically with the Spanish and the Portuguese. Okay. Well, they look over and they see the Spanish and Portuguese are making lots of money in Asia. They want to make money in Asia, and they also want to stop the Spanish king from making money in Asia. They come over here. They have their main base in Batavia. That's Jakarta, Indonesia now. Okay, and Java. That's kind of their main place. But they very quickly come up and they set up a base in Taiwan. Okay. They set the base up in Taiwan to do this trade between Japan and China to try to push the Portuguese out of this business. Okay. Well, first what the Dutch wanted to do originally is they wanted to have a mainland base like the Portuguese had. So, they try to get a base on the Fujian coast. The Chinese push them out. Then they try the pescadores, okay, the islands in the strait between Taiwan and China. Okay. And they try to set up a base there, but then once again, the Chinese admiral comes in, he pushes them out, but he also kind of lets them know that if they go over there to Taiwan, no one will bother them over there. Okay, that's a good place for a base, and Dutch kind of take them up on this. So it's actually 1624 when the Dutch come over and they set up a base in what's now Tainan. Okay. What the Dutch and the Spanish and the Portuguese are all trying to do, they're trying to set up a trade monopoly. They want to monopolize trade in the area so they can make high profits. They don't want to monopolize all trade. There's going to be smaller scale trade going on. But when there's small trade going on, they want to set up a protection racket. They want people to pay them for the right to travel through the oceans. Okay, so basically you have to kind of buy a pass or pay them a fee. Otherwise, their ships may attack you and take your cargo. So, the Dutch, they're trying to displace the Portuguese, and they're doing a pretty good job at this time. The Jungs, okay, the Jungs are also an important family in Taiwan history. They're setting up their own kind of network in this area. They're trying to monopolize trade here. They want to monopolize the Japanese-Chinese trade if they can. Okay. So they're vying with the Dutch. Okay, the Dutch, their monopoly company is the Dutch East India Company, and they're vying with them. Okay, to try to take over this trade. Taiwan is just a convenient base. Okay, early on when the Dutch come here, they're not really interested in anything particular with Taiwan. They just want a base where they can do their business. Now, eventually, what happens is that, mainly for defensive reasons, the Dutch start expanding their control. They want to be safe where they are, so they take a little more territory out there, but that gives them conflict with the Aborigines, so then they get some more fights with the Aborigines. Also, the Spanish decide they don't want the Dutch moving in here. They set up their base in North Taiwan, up in what's now Geelong. And the Dutch feel like they got to go and push them out, so they go up there and fight with the Spanish there. By the 1640s, the Dutch have pretty much taken over the island, except for the mountains. They've taken most of the lowland areas in the mountains. They're mainly interested in trading, but they're having to pay a lot of money to try to keep control of the island. They want to figure out how to pay for this. Okay, so they get more and more interested in the Taiwanese economy. One thing they do is they start trying to sell deer product monopsonies to the Chinese. Okay, so the Aborigine villages, they've each got their own little area where they raise the deer in the deer field and then hunt the deer. Okay. Well, the Dutch say, if you want to trade with a village, we'll give you a monopoly position there. You can do the trading, but you have to pay us a fee. And how large that fee is depends on an auction. Okay, so every so often the Dutch would come in, they would auction off rights to different areas of Taiwan. You get a monopsony there. You're the only one who can buy the deer products. Okay, that way you can make good profits, but the Chinese have to compete to get these monopsonies, and to do that they have to bid for the monopsony, and the Dutch hope to make good money that way, and they make pretty good money. Okay, they also start trying to tax the Chinese farmers. They attract more of these Chinese farmers in. The Chinese farmers originally are just kind of producing food for the Dutch. But more and more Chinese farmers come in. It's not a really good time in Fujian at this period. There's a lot of violence happening there. And so the Chinese move over, and they have to pay money to the Dutch. Okay? This becomes the main source of income for the Dutch on Taiwan. And they very famously say the Chinese are the only bees on Formosa that give honey. Okay, Formosa, that's Taiwan. And they come out and they're saying that the Aborigines, they're good as soldiers. Okay, but if you really want to make money, the Chinese are the ones you got to make the money from. Now, I said the Dutch came to Tainan in 1624. Okay. I looked up sister cities of Tainan. Okay, and I found actually the city I'm from, Columbus, I guess, is a sister city of Tainan. But the city that really should be a sister city for Tainan is New York City. Okay, there's a really strong parallel between New York City and Tainan. Okay, and this is I think it's kind of interesting that the Americas, North America, is being settled at about the same time Taiwan is being settled, and there's many parallels between the Americas and between early Taiwan. Tainan is settled by the Dutch in 1624. New Amsterdam, okay, that's the old name for New York City. It was settled by the Dutch in 1624, the exact same year. The Dutch came to New Amsterdam, New York City, to trade, just like they came to Tainan to trade. Now, they were mainly in New York City, they were trading for pelts, beaver pelts, with the Native Americans. Now, at Tainan, they came here to mainly do trade between China and Japan, but they also end up doing trade in deer products, okay, with the people native to Taiwan. And in both cases, in the 1660s, okay, they get pushed out. Okay, they're pushed out of Taiwan in the 1660s. They're also pushed out of what becomes New York State. They're pushed out of that in the 1660s in the United States by the English. Okay? So this is just one of the many parallels between North America, the United States, and Taiwan, okay, in the early period. Okay, I want to look now a little at the Chinese that were coming to Taiwan at this time. The Chinese and the Dutch, we could call them frenemies. Okay, frenemy, that's, well, you're partly a friend, but you're also an enemy. There's a lot of ways that the Chinese and the Dutch were complementary, and they could make a lot of money together doing trade and just in cooperation. But there was also lots of conflict, okay, lots of fighting and people dying. Both the Zhengs had their kind of maritime empire they were trying to establish, doing the same thing the Dutch were doing. And so, of course, they get into conflicts and they fight. The Chinese in Taiwan, they could use the Dutch there for, helping them to kind of protect areas for farming, and they could protect them from the Aborigines. But, the Dutch also tried to squeeze a lot of money out of the Chinese, and Chinese often revolted, sometimes would revolt, and there would be, fighting and deaths this way. The Chinese, there's some early people that come over, almost the same time the Dutch did, just to, raise food. But one big group of Chinese that come over are brought over by the sugar merchants. The Dutch set up first in Java, okay, that's down in what's now Indonesia. There was already Chinese merchants down there who were, buying sugar, and basically too, they sometimes themselves raised the sugar cane and milled the sugar themselves. When the Dutch come up to Taiwan and start controlling an area, these Chinese merchants decide, hey, this might be a good way to make money. It's closer to our market in China. We'll go up there and try to make some sugar. So they go over to the Fujian coast. They recruit laborers and they bring them over to the Dutch area of Taiwan. and they start, getting the sugar industry going. Okay, so this was something that was started by overseas Chinese that, had first kind of migrated down to Southeast Asia, made money there, and then they come back up to Taiwan to make money here. Okay? So that's how that sugar industry actually begins. But Chinese then gradually start filtering over more and more. By the end of the Dutch era, there's probably about 50,000 Chinese living in Taiwan. Comparatively, the Dutch, the Dutch may be a few thousand at most. Okay, the Dutch are a small population compared to the Chinese, and this is the same throughout Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is gradually being colonized by the West. The Dutch have taken over, a lot of Java. They've set up their base in Batavia. But if you walk the streets of Batavia, you don't see too many Dutch people there. You see a few, but mainly you see Chinese merchants and Chinese workshops with Chinese manufacturers. If you go to Manila, okay, that's where the Spanish have set up their big base. Okay, you walk the streets of Manila, well, there's some Spanish there, there's some Filipinos, but mainly you see Chinese. Okay, lots of Chinese merchants and manufacturers. Okay, so this is something you see throughout Southeast Asia at this time. The Europeans are coming in, they're kind of militarily taking over, but the economies are becoming Chinese. Okay, this happens in Southeast Asia. It also is happening in Taiwan. The 1660s is when the Dutch are finally pushed out. I've talked a little bit about the Zhengs. They're the new group of the big family that's trying to take over trade in this area, particularly the trade between Japan and China. But they're willing to trade with anybody, but they want to monopolize it if they can. Okay, they get into more and more conflicts with the Dutch. But during this period, it's Ming China. This is the time of the Ming-Qing transition. The Manchu people are coming down. They invade China. The Ming dynasty starts retreating. It's going to lose the war. We're going to end up with the Qing Empire in China. And as this happens, one of the Zhengs, Zheng Chenggong, okay, he decides he's going to support the Ming, okay, and try to protect the Ming. So he becomes something of a patriot pirate, okay. But before that, his ancestors would probably just be considered pirates, okay, trying to set up a big pirate kingdom, kind of like what the Dutch were doing, really. The Dutch were pretty much setting up a pirate kingdom. That's kind of what the Portuguese were doing there too. But Zheng Chenggong, because he's supporting the Ming, he goes down in Chinese history as a patriot pirate. Okay, and that makes him, kind of sets him up at an extra high level for, one of the better pirates in Chinese history, if you're a Chinese nationalist. But he has some troubles in Fujian fighting the Qing, and at one point he decides he has to retreat to Taiwan, and to do that he has to push out the Dutch. Well, about this time, the Japanese were beginning to close off their economy, and it was getting harder and harder to trade with Japan. When the Zhengs come over, they attack the Dutch base there. Okay, they end up defeating the Dutch. The Dutch may have been able to hold the base if they would have been willing to reinforce it. Okay, bring in more troops, but they decide it's not worth holding anymore. And finally the Dutch are allowed to march out and leave and go back to Batavia, go back to Java. And then for the next 20 years, it's now Zheng rule in Taiwan. Okay, and the Zhengs, they're a group of people that do things about the same way the Dutch do. They also, sell monopsonies for the deer products, okay, to make money. They try to control trade in the Chinese seas in this area. Sometimes they hold more of Fujian, sometimes they hold less of Fujian, and they retreat to Taiwan. Eventually, though, they're defeated by the Qing, and Taiwan becomes a Qing possession. So Taiwan begins kind of as a business enterprise, but it is a violent business enterprise. Okay, people come to Taiwan to make money. The Dutch came here to set up a trading base. Okay, the Zhengs were kind of also trying to set up, trading base, doing trade here. All of them were doing trade with the Aborigines. The Aborigines were here during trade, though they were already here during trade. The Chinese, they're leaving their homeland in the Fujian. They're coming across the straits to Taiwan. They're also trying to make money. Some of them are merchants, many are just farmers, but they see the land here as being better land. They can get cheaper than anything they can get back in Fujian. So this is a place people come to make money, but property rights are still very weak. So there's lots of conflict. It's all very violent business. The people trying to set up these pirate empires, the Dutch and the Jungs, okay, they have to do this through violence. The Chinese, they come into conflict with the aborigines, okay, when they're trying to set up their farms. The Dutch also come into conflict with the aborigines. Sometimes the Chinese and the Dutch get into fights, okay. So it's a period where there is still a lot of violence. It's not a business in the modern sense, but people did come here to make money. Okay, the problem was who has the right to trade, who owns what. Okay, that all has to be settled, and it hasn't been settled very well yet at this period. Okay. So, for profits, you got to have economic exchange. That means you got to have some sort of cooperation between these peoples. Okay, but you also try to use your strength to try to push people in disadvantageous positions so that you can make better trades than they can. So you try to force the aborigines, when they sell their deer products, you got to force them to sell it to a regional monopsony, so they can they get less less in return for their deer products, and the monopsonists can get more. Okay? The Dutch, they're trying to make good money trading between Japan and China, and they're trying to do that by cutting out other people and keeping them from trading. So that's the period of the 17th century. What's happening in Taiwan when Taiwan first enters into history? Now, there's a lot of books on this, and I'm going to introduce these books to you because I'm not going to tell you too much about the 17th century, but it's kind of considered the romantic period in Taiwanese history. There's a lot more written about the period in the 17th century with the Dutch and Zheng Chenggong, whose other name is Koxinga, okay, than there is written about Qing Dynasty Taiwan. I think that's kind of unfortunate, but that's the way things are. Okay, but these are some of the books out there you can see. The book there called, How Taiwan Became Chinese. That's actually a book you can get for free online. Okay, if you look for it, you'll find it there. Okay, the author of that also wrote Lost Colony. He's a Dutch person who gets into a lot of the Dutch records and writes about the Dutch period. Okay? Another book that came out some years ago about Koxinga. Okay, Zheng Chenggong, the Patriot Pirate. Okay, that's this book here. But it's this is a period that if you're not interested in economics, you're still kind of interested in this history, just because it's a kind of the history of the pirates and the wars and a lot of stuff going on. And places you can go. Okay, if you're in northern Taiwan, you go to Fort Antonio. Okay, that's up in Danshui. That later becomes part of the English consulate. In fact, part of it was a prison for foreigners that kind of got out of hand in Taiwan. You go down south to Tainan, okay, the port area there where Zheng Chenggong finally defeated the Dutch. That's Fort Zeelandia. And then inland away, they also have this Fort Provincia, and you can visit both of those down there. So this is kind of what's happening in Taiwan when it's first being developed in the 17th century. Okay. It's a place that's opened up to international trade. There's Chinese, there's Aborigines, there's Japanese, there's Europeans, and they're all in conflict and in cooperation. Okay, it's a very interesting story. But behind all the story, there's a business story. Okay, people are here and they're trying to make money mainly through trade.